The alarm on my command deck did not sound like victory. It sounded like a warning I refused to hear. My name is Vraxthul Kayan, General of the 3rd Fleet of the Jarn Dominion, and I am recording this account not to boast, but to explain how a war that should have ended in 2 days is still burning 3 months later, and how I am the one who lit the fire. It began the moment our ships broke through Earth's outer defense grid. I remember standing on the bridge of my flagship, watching the blue and green planet grow larger on the view screen, and feeling nothing but calm certainty. I had done this 11 times before. 11 worlds had fallen under my command, and every single one had followed the same pattern. Land forces. Establish a foothold. Identify the leverage point that breaks a species' will to fight. Apply pressure. Accept surrender within days. Humanity, according to every report handed to me by my intelligence division, was going to be the easiest conquest of my career. Their weapons were centuries behind ours. Their governments argued with each other more than they cooperated. Their species was, by every measurable standard, fractured, distracted, and unprepared. So when my strategists proposed the fastest path to submission, I approved it without hesitation. Take the children. It sounds cold when I say it now, stripped of the tactical language we used at the time. Back then, it was simply called priority leverage acquisition. My officers spoke of it the way they might discuss a supply run. On every world we had conquered before, there was always something a population valued more than their own safety, and once we held that thing, resistance collapsed within hours. On some worlds it was sacred ground, on others it was their leadership. For humans, our analysts were confident the answer was their young. I gave the order myself. 3 extraction teams, deployed to 3 major cities under cover of our first wave, tasked with a single objective: retrieve a number of children sufficient to serve as proof of capability, then broadcast the demand for unconditional surrender within 48 hours. I remember Second Commander Ethis standing beside me when the order went out. She had served with me on 4 campaigns, and she rarely questioned my decisions. But that day, she hesitated before confirming the transmission. "General," she said, "the historical files our scouts pulled from their communication networks. There is a pattern in how this species responds to threats against their offspring. I would like more time to review it before we commit." I told her there was no time to waste on sentimental record-keeping. I told her fear was fear, no matter the species, and that fear always bought silence. I was wrong. I did not know it yet, but I was already wrong. The extraction teams moved with precision. I watched the reports scroll across my display. A neighborhood outside a city called Denford, a school building near a river, in a place called Aldermore, a quiet residential block on the outskirts of a coastal town called Bren Hollow. Our teams moved in fast, using suppression fields to keep the human adults disoriented, just long enough to secure the children and withdraw. No permanent harm. That was the instruction I gave, and it was followed. My goal was never destruction. My goal was leverage. A hostage does no good if it is damaged. Within the hour, my teams reported success. 43 children secured across the 3 locations, transported to a holding facility aboard one of our orbital platforms. I remember feeling satisfied, efficient, clean. I ordered the broadcast prepared, a message to every surviving human government, stating plainly what we held and what we required in exchange for their safe return. I expected panic. I expected chaos in their streets, arguments in their remaining council chambers, and within a day, a trembling voice agreeing to every term we set. What I did not expect was silence. Not the silence of shock, not the silence of surrender. A different kind of silence, one I had never encountered on any of the 11 worlds before this one. Their communication networks, which our analysts had described as chaotic and easily monitored, simply stopped broadcasting anything we could intercept. No pleading messages, no desperate negotiations, no public statements begging for mercy. Nothing. I stood on my bridge staring at that silence for a long time, and for reasons I could not name, it unsettled me more than any counterattack could have. Yithis approached again, this time with a data slate in her hand. "General, our listening posts are picking up encrypted traffic between human military installations. Traffic between nations that were, according to our own intelligence briefings, on the edge of open conflict with one another, only days ago." "They are frightened," I said. "Frightened people reach out to anyone who might help them. General," she said again, and there was something careful in her voice, something that should have made me listen harder than I did. "I do not think this is fear. I think this is coordination." I dismissed her. I want to be honest in this record, because I owe it to whoever hears this account after me. I dismissed her not because her observation lacked merit, but because I did not want to believe that a species I had already labeled primitive could organize faster under threat than my own fleet could react to it. I ordered a show of strength instead, a low-altitude flight over one of their capital cities, cameras rolling, weapons visibly armed but not fired, simply to remind them of the position they were in. I wanted them to look up and understand, without any doubt, who controlled the sky above their heads. I sent 3 of my best pilots. I remember their names because I reviewed their files personally before assigning them to the mission. Koresh, Dolm, and young Feyre, who had only been with the fleet for 2 cycles and was eager to prove herself. I told her this would be simple. Fly over the city, let the humans see the ships, return to the platform before evening. None of them returned. Their transponders went silent within minutes of entering the airspace above the city. No wreckage was found. No distress signal was received. Their ships simply stopped transmitting, as if the sky itself had reached out and taken them. I stood on my bridge that night, staring at 3 blank icons on my tactical display where 3 living beings should have been, and for the first time since the invasion began, I felt something cold settle into my chest. Not fear. Not yet, but the first thread of doubt, thin and quiet, working its way into a certainty I had carried across 11 conquered worlds. I told myself it was an anomaly, a malfunction perhaps, or an ambush by some isolated human military unit acting outside the coordination Withis had warned me about. I ordered reconnaissance drones sent in to locate the missing pilots and assess whatever defenses the humans had managed to hide from our initial scans. While the drones prepared for launch, I retreated to my private quarters and, for the first time since arriving at this planet, opened the historical archive our teams had extracted from human networks. I told myself I was simply gathering additional intelligence. In truth, I think some part of me already understood that I needed to know what kind of species I was truly facing. I began reading accounts of human conflicts stretching back centuries, wars fought over land, over belief, over pride. But as I searched further, a different pattern began to surface, one that repeated itself again and again across cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, and languages that shared no common root. Every time, without exception, when a human population believed their children were in danger, the response was the same. Reason gave way to something else. Strategy gave way to something else. Every resource, every ounce of strength, every fracture between rival groups seemed to dissolve the moment their young were threatened, replaced by a singular, unified purpose that no calculation of cost or risk seemed able to slow. I read an old phrase, translated imperfectly by our systems, attributed to dozens of different human cultures in dozens of different forms, all carrying the same meaning. There is no anger like the anger of a parent who believes their child has been taken from them, and there is no limit to what they will do to bring that child home. I closed the archive and sat in the silence of my quarters for a long while, turning that phrase over in my mind. I told myself it was folklore, exaggeration, the kind of dramatic language every species uses to describe its own history. I did not yet understand that I had just read the only warning I would ever receive, and that I had already ignored it once, in the words of my own second commander, before I ever opened that archive at all. Outside my quarters, the drones I had sent to find my missing pilots were already returning, and what they found would end any comfort I still had left. The drones returned just before dawn on the human calendar, and what they carried back was not the answer I expected. I had assumed we would find wreckage. A hidden weapon system, perhaps. Something powerful enough to bring down 3 of our finest pilots without warning. Instead, the drones returned with something far more difficult to process. Footage of empty streets. Footage of homes with lights still burning but no movement inside. Footage of vehicles left abandoned in the middle of roads, doors open, engines still running. It looked, at first glance, like a population that had fled in terror. That was the interpretation my junior officers offered, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to believe it. Perhaps the flyover had worked exactly as intended. Perhaps the humans had scattered into hiding, too frightened to organize any kind of resistance. But Ethos, standing beside me as we reviewed the footage frame by frame, pointed out something I had missed in my relief. "General, look at the pattern of movement. These are not the tracks of a population running blindly from danger. Notice the direction. Every vehicle, every set of footprints leaving these homes moves toward the same series of coordinates." I leaned closer to the display. She was right. What I had mistaken for panic was, in fact, the opposite. It was assembly. Families were not fleeing the city. They were converging, methodically, toward locations that our own scans identified as makeshift staging grounds, hidden beneath overpasses, inside abandoned factories, within underground transit tunnels that our initial planetary survey had barely registered. I ordered a full sensor sweep of the identified coordinates, expecting to find frightened civilians huddled together for safety. What the sweep revealed instead made my throat tighten in a way I had not experienced since my earliest days as a junior officer, long before I held the rank of general. They were building. Not shelters, not hiding places, workshops. I watched thermal imaging of dozens of makeshift facilities, each one alive with activity. Humans of every age working in shifts around the clock, stripping components from civilian vehicles and machinery, welding, wiring, assembling something our analysts could not immediately classify. I brought in our chief engineering officer, a methodical and unemotional being named Torek, to review the footage with me. He watched in silence for a long while before speaking. "General, based on the tools and materials visible in this footage and the speed at which components are being assembled, I estimate these structures are being converted into mobile armor plating and improvised energy shielding. The designs are crude by our standards, but the rate of production is troubling. At this pace, they could field a functional defense force within days, not the months our original assessment predicted." I asked him how a species with technology, centuries behind ours, could achieve that kind of output so quickly. His answer stayed with me longer than almost anything else I heard during that campaign. "General, they are not inventing anything new. They are adapting. Every scrap of existing infrastructure on this planet is being repurposed for a single goal. I have never seen a species mobilize its entire industrial and civilian capacity this fast, without a single central order that we have been able to intercept. It is as if the order was already understood before it needed to be given." I did not want to accept what he was telling me. I ordered a wider reconnaissance sweep, hoping to find evidence that this activity was isolated, confined to the 3 cities where our extraction teams had operated. Perhaps, I told myself, this was simply a local reaction, a pocket of resistance that could be contained before it spread. The results came back within hours, and they shattered that hope completely. Every major population center on the planet showed the same pattern. Nations that our intelligence files described as bitter rivals, some with histories of conflict stretching back generations, were sharing satellite data, opening supply corridors across borders, and in several cases, placing their military command structures under joint authority without any formal treaty being signed. It was as if an invisible switch had been thrown across the entire species simultaneously, and every division that had once kept them fractured and predictable had simply ceased to matter. I called an emergency council with my senior officers that evening, and the mood in that room was unlike anything I had felt in my long career. Confidence had curdled into something closer to unease, though none of us were yet willing to name it. "This is not how a defeated population behaves," said Commander Doss, who had served with distinction during the conquest of 2 previous worlds. This is not fear. This is preparation for something they intend to win. They cannot win, I said, more sharply than I intended. They do not have the ships. They do not have the weapons. They barely have the ability to leave their own atmosphere in any meaningful capacity. Yithis spoke then, quietly, but with a certainty that cut through the room. General, with respect, I do not believe they intend to fight us in the way we understand fighting. I do not believe they are building an army to meet us in open combat. I believe they are building the tools to reach the one thing that matters more to them than survival itself. I understood what she meant, though I did not want to. The children. I ordered increased security around the orbital holding facility immediately, doubling the guard rotation and reinforcing the perimeter with additional defense systems. I told myself this was a simple precaution, that no ground-based force, however determined, could realistically threaten an orbital platform protected by our full defensive array. That confidence lasted less than a day. Reports began arriving from our monitoring stations of unusual launch signatures across multiple human nations. Small craft, nothing close to the scale of a true starship, but enough to reach low orbit. Our analysts dismissed them initially as incapable of posing any real threat. Primitive rockets repurposed from older space programs long thought abandoned. I should have listened to the part of myself that remembered what Torek had told me only hours earlier. They are not inventing anything new. They are adapting. Every scrap of existing infrastructure on this planet is being repurposed for a single goal. I ordered additional patrols along our orbital perimeter as a precaution, but I did not yet believe these small, crude vessels represented any genuine danger. I still believed, despite everything I had already witnessed, that this was a species reacting emotionally, without the discipline or capability to translate that emotion into an effective threat. I was still thinking in the patterns of 11 previous conquests. I had not yet allowed myself to accept that this world did not follow those patterns at all. That night, as I reviewed the day's reports alone in my quarters, I found myself returning to the old human phrase I had read in the archive. There is no anger like the anger of a parent who believes their child has been taken from them, and there is no limit to what they will do to bring that child home. I began to wonder, for the first time, whether I had misjudged not the strength of this species, but the very nature of what drove them. On every world before this one, populations fought for territory, for resources, for ideology, for pride. Those motivations could be measured, weighed, and eventually exhausted. A population fighting for territory will eventually calculate that the cost of continued resistance outweighs the value of what remains to be defended. A population fighting for ideology can be worn down over time, its belief eroded by repeated demonstration of futility. But a parent does not calculate cost against a child. There is no acceptable number of losses that outweighs the value of what has been taken. There is no point at which continued resistance becomes irrational, because the alternative, accepting the loss permanently, is not something the mind allows itself to consider as a viable option at all. I did not yet know how right that instinct would prove to be. I still believed, on some level, that reason would eventually reassert itself, that even the fiercest determination has limits imposed by simple physical reality. Humans did not have the ships. They did not have the weapons. Surely, I told myself, that reality alone would force a ceiling onto whatever they were building beneath their cities. I fell asleep that night still clinging to that belief. I woke to the sound of alarms, and the news that our orbital holding facility had detected unauthorized craft entering its defensive perimeter. The humans had arrived faster than any of my officers believed possible, and they had not come to negotiate. I reached the bridge within minutes of the alarm sounding, still processing what my officers were telling me. Unauthorized craft, dozens of them, approaching the orbital platform where the children were being held. My first assumption was that these were the same crude rockets our analysts had dismissed only hours earlier, incapable of posing any real threat to a fully shielded orbital installation. That assumption lasted only as long as it took the first wave to reach our perimeter. I watched on the tactical display as small, unremarkable craft, each one barely larger than a transport shuttle, began arriving in staggered formation rather than a single coordinated assault. At first, this looked like poor tactics, uncoordinated and easy to intercept. Our automated defense grid engaged immediately, and I expected the engagement to end within moments. It did not. The human craft scattered the instant our defense grid opened fire, breaking into smaller groups and altering course with a responsiveness that caught our targeting systems off guard. Torek, standing beside me at the tactical station, narrowed his eyes at the display. "General, these pilots are not following any doctrine in our threat database. They are reacting individually, making decisions faster than a coordinated fleet typically requires, yet somehow avoiding collisions with each other. I do not believe this is chaos. I believe this is a form of coordination we have not encountered before." I did not have time to consider the implications of his observation, because at that moment, 3 of the human craft broke through our outer defense line entirely, weaving between defensive fire with a precision that should not have been possible given the technological gap our own reports had confirmed only days earlier. They did not fire on the platform itself. That detail struck me even in the chaos of the moment. Every craft that breached our perimeter moved directly toward the section of the platform housing the detention facility, ignoring more strategically valuable targets entirely. They were not trying to destroy us. They were trying to reach one specific location, and nothing else mattered to them. I ordered our internal security forces to reinforce the detention level immediately, but even as the order left my mouth, I understood the deeper problem taking shape in front of me. This was not a rescue attempt built around stealth or subtlety. It was a direct assault, willing to absorb whatever losses were necessary to reach its objective, and I did not yet know how many more waves were coming behind this first one. I did not have to wait long to find out. Within the hour, our long-range sensors detected a second, larger wave approaching from multiple points across the planet's surface simultaneously, launched from locations our reconnaissance had identified only the day before as simple workshops. The crude armor and shielding Torek had warned me about was no longer theoretical. It was here, wrapped around small attack craft that should not have been capable of reaching orbit, let alone engaging our forces once they arrived. I called for reinforcements from the rest of the fleet, positioned across the system to secure other strategic points on the planet's surface. As those reinforcements began arriving, I finally allowed myself to review, in full, the ground reports that had been accumulating since the previous evening, reports I had been too preoccupied to examine closely until now. What I found in those reports unsettled me more deeply than the assault unfolding above the planet. Every human military unit, still capable of independent action, had abandoned its previous strategic objectives entirely. Defensive positions that our analysts had identified as critical to any rational military strategy were left undermanned or completely empty. Supply depots that should have been heavily guarded were operating with skeleton crews. By every conventional standard of warfare, the human forces below us were making catastrophic strategic errors, exposing themselves to exploitation on a dozen fronts at once. I asked Commander Doss for his assessment, expecting him to confirm what seemed obvious. Instead, his answer unsettled me further. "General, if I did not know better, I would say these are the decisions of a force that has already decided the outcome of every other engagement does not matter. They are not defending territory. They are not protecting supply lines. Every unit still capable of movement is converging on a single objective, and they are willing to sacrifice every other advantage to reach it." I understood, in that moment, that I was not facing a military strategy in any sense I recognized. I was facing something closer to an instinct, one shared simultaneously across an entire species, discarding every rule of calculated warfare in favor of a single, unified purpose that no cost seemed capable of altering. I ordered a review of the historical archive again, this time instructing my intelligence division to search specifically for any recorded precedent of a human population behaving this way, hoping to find some historical ceiling, some point at which this kind of mobilization had eventually broken under its own unsustainable weight. What they found instead were case after case of exactly the opposite. Conflicts where outmatched, poorly equipped groups had continued fighting long after any rational calculation suggested they should have surrendered, specifically because the alternative involved a threat to their children. Entire nations that mobilized every available resource, economic, industrial, and human, toward a single objective within days of such a threat emerging, and sustained that mobilization for months or years afterward, regardless of losses suffered along the way. One entry in particular stayed with me. A translated account from a conflict centuries in the planet's past, describing how a besieged population, facing overwhelming odds and dwindling resources, chose to continue fighting rather than accept terms that would have guaranteed the safety of everyone except their children. The account noted, almost as an aside, that the opposing force eventually withdrew, not because it had been defeated in any conventional sense, but because the cost of continuing to face that level of sustained, unyielding resistance eventually became greater than the value of whatever victory remained achievable. I began to understand, reading that account in the middle of an active battle above the very planet it described, that I had made an error far more serious than a single tactical miscalculation. I had misjudged the entire framework this species operated within. I had assumed, as I had on every world before this one, that fear could be used as a tool to produce compliance. I now understood that for humans, threatening their children did not produce fear that could be leveraged. It produced a kind of resolve that treated every other consideration, including their own survival, as secondary. The battle above the planet continued to intensify as I sat with this realization. Our reinforcements arrived and began pushing back the human assault craft, and for a brief period, I believed we might regain control of the situation. Our numbers, our shielding, our weapons technology, all of it remained objectively superior. By every measurable standard of military strength, we should have overwhelmed the human forces within a matter of hours. But the human pilots did not withdraw when logic suggested they should have. Craft that had taken damage severe enough to compromise their systems continued pressing forward rather than retreating to safety. Pilots ejected from disabled vessels and were retrieved, almost immediately, by other craft that broke formation specifically to recover them, exposing themselves to further risk in the process. I watched this pattern repeat itself dozens of times over the course of the engagement, and I began to understand that I was not simply facing a determined enemy. I was facing an enemy that had collectively decided the mission could not fail, regardless of individual cost. Euthys approached me during a brief lull in the fighting, her expression carrying none of the satisfaction I might have expected from an officer watching our defenses hold. Instead, she looked as unsettled as I felt. "General, our forces are winning this engagement by every metric we use to measure victory. We are destroying more of their craft than they are destroying of ours. Their casualties are significantly higher than our own. And yet I do not believe they intend to stop. Every population has a breaking point," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I no longer fully believed them. "Perhaps," Euthys said. "But General, I do not believe we have found theirs yet, and I am no longer certain one exists in the way we understand the concept. I ordered a full assessment of our remaining defensive capacity, and what I learned troubled me further. Our shielding systems, though holding, were being tested at a rate our engineers had not anticipated. Our munitions reserves, while still substantial, were depleting faster than our original projections for an entire planetary campaign. We had prepared for a conflict measured in days, built around the assumption that a decisive early show of force would produce rapid capitulation. We had not prepared for a species willing to sustain continuous, escalating pressure indefinitely, absorbing losses that would have ended resistance on any of the 11 worlds I had conquered before this one, in pursuit of an objective that mattered more to them than the war itself. I stood on my bridge, watching the battle continue to unfold above a planet I had believed would fall within 48 hours. And for the first time in my long career, I did not know how this campaign would end. What I did know with a certainty that settled into me like cold water, was that the decision to take those children had not weakened this species as I intended. It had done the opposite. It had unified them, focused them, and stripped away every hesitation that might otherwise have slowed their response. I had spent my career studying how to break a species' will to resist. I was only now beginning to understand that I had, without meaning to, discovered a species that did not appear to have one to break, at least not where their children were concerned. The battle raged on through the night, and somewhere below us, on a planet I had grossly underestimated, an entire species continued moving toward us, with a purpose I was only beginning to comprehend. By the third day of continuous engagement, I no longer recognized the campaign I had launched as the same operation described in my original orders. What had begun as a simple demonstration of force, a calculated show of leverage meant to secure a quick and bloodless surrender, had transformed into something I could only describe as a war of attrition against an opponent who did not appear to understand the concept of attrition at all. Our shielding around the orbital platform held, but only through constant reinforcement and repair, drawing resources away from every other operation across the planet. Our forward bases on the surface, originally intended to secure key resource and population centers as leverage for negotiation, found themselves increasingly isolated as human forces bypassed them entirely, refusing to engage on any front except the one that led directly toward their children. I called a full council meeting on the morning of the fourth day, and the atmosphere among my senior officers had shifted entirely from the confidence we carried into this campaign. Commander Doss, normally measured in his assessments, spoke first. "General, I have reviewed our current resource projections. If this rate of engagement continues, our munitions reserves will be critical within 9 days. Our reinforcement pipeline from the rest of the fleet cannot sustain losses at this rate indefinitely." "And what alternative do you propose?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew what he would say. "I believe we should consider releasing the children," Doss said, "not as an admission of defeat, but as a strategic recalibration. If the objective driving this level of resistance is removed, their forces may lose the singular purpose currently unifying them." I considered his suggestion carefully, weighing it against everything I had witnessed over the previous 3 days. Torek, still monitoring engineering reports from his station, spoke before I could respond. "General, I would advise caution with that assumption. Based on the pattern of behavior we have observed, I do not believe releasing the children now would produce the calming effect Commander Doss anticipates. I believe it would confirm to every human commander, and by extension every human civilian, that we are capable of doing this in the first place. I do not believe that knowledge would produce relief. I believe it would produce a permanent unwillingness to ever consider trusting any agreement we offer in the future." Yethys nodded in agreement, and something in her expression told me she had already reached the same conclusion I was slowly arriving at myself. "General, I do not believe this conflict can be resolved through the framework we originally intended. We approached this as a negotiation backed by leverage. I no longer believe negotiation is possible in the way we understood it when this campaign began." I sat with that assessment for a long moment before making my decision. Despite Torek's warning, I believed we had reached a point where continuing to hold the children served no purpose except to prolong a conflict that was steadily draining our resources with no clear path to the swift victory I had originally promised the Dominion command structure overseeing this campaign. I ordered the release. I want to be honest in this account about what happened next, because I believe it represents the moment I fully understood the scale of my miscalculation. We transmitted our intention to release the children through every channel we could access, along with coordinates for a safe transfer at a neutral location on the planet's surface. I expected this gesture to be met with immediate, visible relief. I expected, at minimum, a pause in hostilities long enough for the transfer to occur safely. Instead, the assault intensified. Human forces pressed harder in the hours following our announcement, not softer. Yethys, reviewing the response alongside me, offered an explanation that I did not want to accept but could not dispute. "General, I do not believe they trust the announcement. From their perspective, we are the same force that took the children in the first place. An offer of release, delivered under pressure, likely reads to them as a tactic rather than a genuine gesture. I believe they intend to secure the children themselves, by force, rather than accept a transfer they cannot verify is safe. The transfer, when it eventually occurred under heavy escort from both sides, was tense beyond anything I had experienced in my career. I watched the exchange through remote surveillance, human parents and guardians receiving their children back at the designated coordinates, and I expected, even then, some sign that the conflict might finally begin to wind down. It did not. Within hours of the successful transfer, human forces continued their advance, this time directed not toward the orbital platform, which no longer held anything of value to them, but toward our remaining ground installations across the planet. Torik's warning had proven correct. The release of the children had not extinguished their resolve. It had confirmed, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what we were capable of, and removed any remaining hesitation about the necessity of ensuring we could never do it again. I stood on my bridge that evening, watching reports of continued human advances across every front, and I finally allowed myself to fully absorb the truth I had been circling for days without confronting directly. This was never going to end the way my previous 11 campaigns had ended. There would be no moment of surrender, no negotiated withdrawal on terms favorable to the Dominion. I had triggered something in this species that could not simply be reasoned back into dormancy, and every subsequent action we took, however well-intentioned, seemed only to deepen their determination rather than diminish it. I reviewed, once more, the ancient phrase I had first encountered days earlier in the human archive, and it no longer felt like folklore or exaggeration to me. There is no anger, like the anger of a parent who believes their child has been taken from them, and there is no limit to what they will do to bring that child home. I understood now that I had misread this phrase entirely when I first encountered it. I had treated it as a description of an emotional response, something intense but ultimately finite, capable of being satisfied and then set aside once the immediate threat was removed. I understood now that it was not describing an emotion at all, at least not in the way I had assumed. It was describing a shift, a fundamental change in how a population organized itself, its priorities, and its tolerance for risk, one that did not simply fade once its original trigger was addressed. Yithis found me alone on the bridge late that night, the rest of the command staff having retreated to rest during the brief lull in direct engagement. She did not speak for a long moment, simply standing beside me as we both watched the tactical display, still lit with the positions of human forces continuing their steady, relentless advance across the planet's surface. "General," she finally said, "I do not believe we can win this campaign in any form that would satisfy the objectives we were given." I did not argue with her. I had reached the same conclusion myself, though admitting it aloud carried a weight I was not yet prepared to fully accept. "What would you recommend?" I asked her. "I believe we need to consider full withdrawal," she said. "Not as a tactical retreat to regroup, but as a genuine end to this campaign. I do not believe any amount of additional force will produce the surrender we were sent here to secure. I believe, if anything, additional force will only strengthen their resolve further, the same way every action we have taken so far has done." I thought of the 11 worlds behind me, each one a campaign that had followed the pattern I understood, the pattern I had built my entire career upon. I thought of how confidently I had approached this operation, certain that humanity would prove no different from any species that came before it. I understood now, standing on that bridge with my second commander beside me and an entire planet still mobilizing beneath us, that I had made an assumption at the very beginning of this campaign that no amount of subsequent strategy could correct. I had assumed that what makes a species dangerous is the strength of its weapons, or the size of its fleet, or the sophistication of its technology. I understood now that the most dangerous thing about humanity had nothing to do with any of those measurements at all. It was this: once you threaten what they love most, there is no version of them left that calculates risk the way every other species I had encountered calculated it. There is no ceiling, There is no exhaustion point built into their resolve that I could locate, measure, or exploit. I had spent my career learning how to defeat populations by finding the point at which their fear outweighed their will to resist. Humanity's fear, I now understood, did not outweigh anything. It simply became fuel for a will to resist that showed no sign of running out. I am recording the final portion of this account from what remains of my command deck, surrounded by systems operating at a fraction of their original capacity, and I want to describe, as clearly as I can, exactly how this campaign reached its conclusion, so that whoever reviews this record afterward understands precisely where I failed. Following my conversation with Yethys that night, I made the decision to formally recommend a full withdrawal to Dominion High Command. I want to be honest that this recommendation was not well received. My superiors had grown accustomed to my record of successful conquests, and a request to abandon an operation against a species we still, on paper, vastly outmatched in raw technological terms, was met with considerable resistance. I was ordered to continue the campaign, to escalate our efforts rather than retreat from them, and to secure the surrender that had been promised at the outset of this operation. I followed those orders, though every instinct I had developed over the preceding days told me they would only make our situation worse. I was correct. We committed additional forces to key strategic positions across the planet, hoping to establish defensible strongholds that might finally slow the human advance long enough to force a negotiation from a position of renewed strength. Instead, we found ourselves defending increasingly isolated positions against a population that seemed to grow more resourceful with each passing day, incorporating captured or salvaged elements of our own technology into their improvised defenses and weapons with a speed our engineering staff found genuinely difficult to comprehend. Torek, examining recovered wreckage from one of our lost forward positions, described it to me with something approaching professional admiration, despite the circumstances. "General, they are learning our systems faster than any species I have studied. I believe every engagement we have with them teaches them something new about our technology, and they are applying those lessons almost immediately. I do not believe this rate of adaptation is sustainable for us." He was right. Over the following weeks, engagements that should have favored us decisively, based on every technological advantage we still held, began ending with losses that our command structure found increasingly difficult to justify. Reinforcements from the wider Dominion fleet, initially generous, began arriving in smaller numbers, as other campaigns across the wider war effort competed for the same limited resources, and as the cost of this particular campaign became harder to conceal from those overseeing the Dominion's broader strategic priorities. I want to describe, honestly, the moment I finally understood there would be no version of victory available to us on this world. It came during what should have been a minor engagement, a skirmish over a supply route that our analysts believed held little strategic value to the human forces. I watched the engagement unfold from my command deck, expecting a quick, decisive outcome in our favor given the relatively low stakes involved for the human side. Instead, I watched human forces defend that supply route with the same absolute, unyielding commitment they had shown defending every objective connected, however distantly, to the safety of their people. There was no distinction, in their conduct, between a critical objective and a minor one. Every position was defended as though it were the last line protecting something irreplaceable, because I finally understood that, in their minds, it was. Every soldier, every pilot, every engineer working in those hidden workshops beneath their cities understood themselves to be part of a single, continuous effort to ensure that what had happened to their children could never happen again, to anyone, anywhere on their world. That was the moment I finally understood the true scope of my original mistake, and I want to state it plainly, because I believe it is the single most important lesson of this entire campaign. I had assumed that taking their children would demonstrate our power and break their will to resist. Instead, it had demonstrated to every human being on that planet exactly what they were capable of when that will was tested, and it had shown them, more clearly than any recruitment effort or propaganda campaign ever could, precisely what they were fighting to prevent from ever happening again. I had defined them, unified them, and given them a purpose more powerful than any strategic objective I could have offered as an alternative. Dominion High Command eventually reached the same conclusion I had arrived at weeks earlier, though it came at a cost far greater than it needed to. After sustained losses that grew increasingly difficult to justify against the value of the planet itself, the order for full withdrawal was finally issued. I want to note, for the sake of accuracy, that this was not a negotiated withdrawal. There was no meeting between our representatives and theirs, no formal agreement outlining terms. We simply reached a point where continuing the campaign cost more than any conceivable benefit could justify, and we left. I do not know, even now, whether the humans considered this a victory in the way they understood the term. I suspect, based on everything I observed during those months, that they did not fully relax their vigilance even after our withdrawal began. Reports from our rear guard indicated that human forces continued monitoring our retreating fleet closely, as though unwilling to fully trust that the threat had ended simply because we had stopped advancing. I understand that caution now. I do not believe I would trust an enemy who had done what we did either. I sit here now, recording this account in what I intend to be a formal warning to any Dominion officer who might, in the future, consider a similar strategy against this species or any other that shares this particular characteristic. I want to be clear about the lesson I believe this campaign teaches, because I believe it applies far beyond this single conflict. Every species we had previously encountered responded to threats against their population according to a calculable framework. Fear produced hesitation. Hesitation produced negotiation. Negotiation produced terms favorable to whichever side held the greater leverage. This framework had served the Dominion successfully across 11 worlds, and I had no reason, based on that record, to expect this world would prove any different. I understand now that this framework assumes something about the nature of fear that does not hold true universally. It assumes that fear, once triggered, remains something a population continues to experience passively, something that can be managed, sustained, and eventually leveraged into compliance. Humanity's fear did not remain passive. It transformed, almost immediately, into something active, something that discarded every calculation of acceptable risk the moment their children were threatened. I do not believe this transformation was a conscious strategic decision made by their leadership. I believe it was something closer to an instinct, shared simultaneously across their entire species, one that superseded every other consideration the moment it was triggered. I made the mistake of treating that instinct as a weakness to be exploited, the same way I had exploited similar vulnerabilities on every world before this one. I understand now that I had it backward entirely. It was not a weakness. It was the single most dangerous characteristic this species possessed, more dangerous than any weapon or technology we encountered during the entire campaign, because it was not something that could be destroyed, negotiated with, or worn down through sustained pressure. It could only be avoided entirely, and once triggered, it did not appear to have an endpoint until its original cause was fully and permanently addressed. I took human children, believing it would demonstrate our power and secure a swift, favorable resolution to this campaign. I understand now that this was the last mistake I will ever make in service of the Dominion, and I believe it should be remembered by every officer who comes after me, as the moment an entire fleet learned exactly what happens when you threaten something a species is not willing to lose under any circumstances. We left that world without the surrender we came for, without the resources we hoped to secure, and without the 11 officers, including young Feyre, whose names I have made certain are recorded honestly alongside my own in this account. I do not know what became of the children we took, beyond confirmation that they were returned safely to their families before our final withdrawal. I hope, for whatever it is worth coming from someone who caused them harm in the first place, that they were able to return to something resembling the lives they had before we arrived. As for humanity itself, I believe they are still watching the skies, still building, still remembering exactly what we showed them we were capable of. I do not believe they have forgotten, and based on everything I witnessed during those months, I do not believe they ever will. This is Vraxthul Kane, formerly General of the Third Fleet of the Zharn Dominion, closing this record with the only conclusion I can offer with complete honesty. We did not lose that war because humanity was stronger than us in the ways we knew how to measure strength. We lost because we taught them, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what they were capable of when everything that mattered to them was on the line, and there was no version of this campaign, once that lesson was learned, that was ever going to end the way I originally intended. End of record.